All right, so today we're going to start the biology portion of the class. And I want to start with something called the levels of biological complexity. And the idea here is that we're a fully functioning organism, but to get to this organismal state, you have to take small pieces and build them on top of each other until you finally build an organism. And that's what this is talking about here. These are the levels of biological or the levels of anatomical complexity. And the goal here is to build an organism. Okay. So let's just start off here. This is a little out of focus, and so can I stand on your chair just real quick, Gwen?
Yeah.
And you're in the action zone right here. I think I can just get this to clear up real quick. There we go. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to start at the smallest level, and we're going to build all these things together until we get to the organismal level. So this is where we're starting here. And so my question to you is, what are the smallest units that not only build the human body, but build all matter on life? What are the smallest units that can't be broken down into any other units by normal chemical means? Atoms. See, you guys have just been saturated with atoms the past couple days, and so those are the smallest levels, are the different atoms. You know, and you can go to the periodic table for the different types of atoms. There are sodium atoms, carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, all that type of stuff. So those are the smallest level. But then what's going to happen is these individual atoms are going to form chemical bonds with each other, and they're going to form something called molecules. Atoms form chemical bonds with each other, and they form molecules. What type of?
Can I just point out something
Yeah.
really quick? Just if you guys look at those, can you tell what those atoms are? The black ones, or what do you think?
Just by color?
Yeah.
Carbon.
Carbon. The blue ones are what? Hydrogen, and the red one?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. Just, you can already tell that, I hope. Yeah.
All right. So first question for you, what type of chemical bond is it when atoms share electrons? They reach stability by sharing electrons. What kind of chemical bond is that? You haven't covered it in chemistry, but it's been mentioned.
Covalent.
It's a covalent bond. And what type of chemical bond is it where one atom takes an electron from another atom? It's an ionic bond. And those are the main bonds that we're going to talk about in this class. So you take atoms together and you form molecules. These are some examples of molecule. Water's a great one. We're going to be talking about water a lot in this class. You take two hydrogens, you combine it to an oxygen, and you have water. And then there's also something called the macromolecules. And these are large molecules that are building blocks for the body. And proteins, carbohydrates, lipids are all macromolecules. I'm going to spend a lot of time with those. And then what's going to happen is those molecules, and specifically these macromolecules, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, they're going to come together and form something called organelles. And organelles are these structures within a cell that all have different functions. Okay, if you have a car, you know there's different pieces to the car. There's the carburetor, and there's the gas tank, and you know I don't know much about cars, the axles and brakes, you know, and all that kind of stuff. But you put all those together and you form a car. And the idea is the same here, is that you take all these organelles, these different organelles that have different functions, you surround them by a plasma membrane, and you know, now you have a functioning cell. So now we're at the organelle level. And so you take those organelles, and some examples of some organelles are mitochondria. Maybe you've heard of mitochondria before. Nucleus, Golgi apparatus, rough endoplasmic reticulum, but those are all different types of organelles. And like I said, you take those organelles, you surround them by a plasma membrane, and that takes you to the next level of biological complexity, which is the cellular level. And here's an example of a cell. These are all different organelles within the cell the nucleus, a vacuole, mitochondria here, Golgi apparatus, ribosomes. We're going to talk about all these. But you surround it by a plasma membrane, and that takes it to the cellular level. And the cellular level is pretty special. This is basically, I like to think of 160 biology. 160 is a cell biology class. Okay, we're talking about individual cells. And cells are important from an anatomical perspective because cells are the structural units of the body. It's the individual cells that build the body. And cells are also the functional units of the body. They're the individual units that are going to perform the different functions of the body. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more. So you have the cellular level, and then everything after this is basically what we talk about in anatomy and physiology. Okay, we start A&P 1 by talking about the tissues. And tissues are collections of cells and cell products that perform a specific function. And the body's made up of 4 different types of tissue. There's epithelial tissue that covers the body. There is connective tissue that holds the body together. There's nervous tissue, and then there's muscle tissue. And then what happens is you go from the tissue level to the organ level. And what an organ is they're discrete structures composed of at least 2 tissue types that perform a specific function for the body. And I wish they chose a different example here, but they chose a blood vessel as an example of an organ, which it is, but I think the heart would be a little more intuitive. So the organ level, they're discrete structures within the body that perform a specific function, and they're made up of 2 or more different tissue types. Here in the blood vessel is lined by epithelial tissue. Underneath epithelial tissue, there's some connective tissue in there, and blood vessels also have smooth muscle in them. So those are 3 different types of tissues found in that organ. And then you get to you take different organs and you put them together into a system that performs, again, a specific function. So the organ system level are different organs that work together to perform a function for the body. We have 12 different organ systems in the body. You put all those together and you get to the organismal level. So going from taking your prerequisites here, going from chemistry all the way to microbiology, you're just clicking off different levels of this biological complexity. Chemistry, you're talking about atoms and molecules. Bio 160, we talk about organelles and cells. And then A&P, you talk about tissues, organs, organ systems, and organismal homeostasis. Cool. Yeah, so this class, we're going to try to combine all of those guys there. Now I do want to, I want to integrate some chemistry into this. And basically what I want to do, I guess, is I want to start at this smallest level and talk about different atoms of the body. We'll talk about different molecules of the body. And we'll get to the cellular level. So I basically just want to do a little overview of atoms, molecules, organelles, and cells. All right, so here we have the periodic table of the elements, which is, great. You're familiar with that now. And these are all the different elements that are found in the universe, as far as we know. But only a handful of these are found in the human body. And in fact, there's 4 atoms that compose the majority of the human body. And so what I want you guys to do maybe is just take a minute and talk with your neighbor. And why don't you come up with what you think the 4 most common atoms are in the human body? Did you guys already do this?
No.
Okay. So find out what you guys think are the 4 most common atoms in the human body, and then try to put them in order of which you think is the most down to the 4th most. And by the way, this is by weight, not by atom number, by atom weight. Not by the number of atoms in the body, but you know, how much of our mass is composed of this atom versus this atom.
That's not. That's a compound. We're talking atoms.
Yep, atoms.
I'm thinking.
What do you think?
I'm thinking carbon, calcium, phosphorus, and nitrogen, maybe. That's what I'm thinking. And I'm thinking in order. Yeah.
And while you're at it, you can just make a list of any type of atoms you think are found in the body. Atoms, not molecules. Atoms, not molecules.
Oh, like in a long list?
Yeah, but I don't know how much that is. And then you have iron.
What do we have to do for like a combination?
By, well, yeah, it's going by weight.
Okay, just a couple more seconds.
So. I mean, we know that there's like sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium.
Okay, who wants to give, I just give one answer per person, but who wants to take a guess at what the most abundant atom is in the body with regards to what atom makes up the majority of the weight of the body?
Carbon.
Okay, we have carbon. Does anybody, what else? Oxygen. Yeah.
Nitrogen?
Okay.
Calcium?
Calcium. Hydrogen. All right. And the answer is oxygen. 65% of the weight of the human body is made up of oxygen. What do we think is second? Or what do we think the next 3 are? What do we think the next most common are?
Carbon?
Carbon. What's attached to a lot of oxygen in the body? Hydrogen. And nitrogen. Carbon is 18.5, hydrogen is 9.5, nitrogen is 3.3. And then there's a lot of other atoms or elements that fall below that 3.3 range. What are some other important atoms or elements in the body?
Phosphorus.
Phosphorus, we had calcium,
Nitrogen.
iron, sodium, potassium. Sodium and potassium are super important. So calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. This calcium and phosphorus is kind of surprising, isn't it? That it's only 1.5%. Why is that surprising? Why would you think it would be more? Because your bones are made up of calcium and phosphorus. But it's only down to 1.5%. And I put a link. There's a really good, has anybody watched Breaking Bad? Yes. Chemistry, you know. There's this scene on season 1, episode 3. It's the introductory scene, and I put a link to a video on it. I'm not going to show it in class because it's not super appropriate. But basically, there's this body has turned into liquid, and it's going back and forth between Walter when his chemistry days, and they're going through the composition of the human body and talking about it and stuff, and they're contrasting it with the fact that this body had just done its thing. But anyways, it was pretty entertaining. All right, so let's take a little closer dive in this. This is the composition of the human body, and as you guys all probably know, 60 to 70% of the weight of the body is water. And what is water? H2O. So just in and of itself, I mean, you're like, well, where's all that oxygen at? Well, a lot of it's in water because 70% of the body is made of water. This is a little schematic that you should get used to, but these are the different fluid compartments in the body, different places where we find water. All the fluids in the body are water-based. They're all about 90% water. So inside the cell, the intracellular fluid, this is all water. The space in between the cells that we call interstitial fluid, that's made up of water. Plasma, which is the fluid portion of blood, that's made up of water. So when you look at it in that way, it's not surprising, you know, that 65% of the human body is made up of oxygen by weight. What's another place that we find oxygen in the body?
The lungs.
Your blood.
Well, in the lungs, but in the lungs, it's not quite in our body yet. What happens is it has to cross the lungs and go into the blood.
Yeah.
Yep. And this picture right here, this is in the lungs. This is the microscopic version of the lungs. And this is a single air sac in the lungs, which there's millions of these small air sacs in the lungs that we call alveoli. And this is a single alveoli and alveolus. And wrapped around it are the pulmonary capillaries, and this is where gas exchange occurs. So you breathe in oxygen, that oxygen travels into the blood, and it goes inside the red blood cell. And so a lot of oxygen is actually within the red blood cells of our body. Carbon dioxide, cells produce carbon dioxide as a metabolic waste product. And so there's a lot of oxygen wrapped up in carbon dioxide as well.
Can I mention something?
Yeah.
Yesterday, we go back one slide. Yesterday I talked about the diatomic acids, oxygen being one of them. So you see how it's O2 up there? Just remind me of that, we talked about that.
It's always O2. Yep, it's always O2. Next, what I want to do is look at the different macromolecules of the body, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, and look at the molecular structure and see what actual atoms make up those molecules. Because flipping back a few slides, or just one slide, the other, you know, there's about, let's say there's 70% here, there's about 28% that are represented by the macromolecules of the body. And then another 2% are other ions and small molecules. But 25% of the human body weight are these macromolecules, about half of which are proteins, another large part are carbohydrates, and another decent chunk are lipids. So the body's made up of water, and then mostly these macromolecules, and then nucleic acids, which is the DNA inside your cell. And so let's start with proteins. We're going to go in depth about the structure of proteins and all this other kind of stuff, but this is just to show you a basic version of it. A protein is what we call a polymer. And poly means many, mer means unit. So proteins are molecules that are made up of individual units. So this is an example of a protein, and this protein, since it's a polymer, it's made up of these individual units. And what are these individual units that make up proteins? What are proteins made from?
Amino acids.
Amino acids. Each one of these little units is an amino acid. And there's 20 different amino acids in the body that make these proteins. And this is just an example of some of them. These are a group of amino acids that classify as hydrophobic. What does that mean, hydrophobic?
Repel water.
It's water-fearing. It repels water. Exactly. So each one of these individual amino acids is one of these things. In fact, this is glycine, and here's the structure of glycine. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, what I want to do is find out what are these molecules actually made out of. So what are some, what atoms are these amino acids made out of? That's kind of small, but what do you guys see up there?
Carbon.
There's carbon right in the center, right where Jen said it was going to be, right? Because it has 4 bonds. What else?
Hydrogen.
Hydrogen, a lot of hydrogen, oxygen, and what other one?
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen. Okay, that's where we find a lot of the nitrogen in the body is in the proteins. And then these are just some examples. These are different proteins, different examples of proteins in the body. And so these are different places, you know, these are different things that are made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. That's the point that I'm trying to make. This is a hemoglobin molecule. Where do we find hemoglobin?
In the blood, red blood cells. White blood cells?
In the red blood
Red
cells.
blood cells.
Yep, so it's not found in the blood, it's found within, well, it's found within the red blood cells in the blood. And each red blood cell has about 250 hemoglobin molecules. This is what a hemoglobin molecule looks like. And I use this every quarter up into A&P as an example of different, you know, of different stuff. And these hemoglobin molecules, they're made up of 4 protein chains. They call them these globin chains. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. So these are all polymers of amino acids. Each one of those, I think, is 146 amino acids. And then within each of these protein chains, you have what's called a heme group. And this heme group, it's like this, I don't know, hexagon or some type of structure. It's a carbon ring structure that's like so. And dead in the middle of that is what?
Iron.
That's iron. Why is that iron there?
Do you have iron in your blood?
You do have iron in your blood. Why do you have iron in your blood? That iron is going to bind oxygen. Okay, that's where the O2 molecule binds, is right on that iron. Okay. Other places we find proteins are skeletal muscles made up of proteins, enzymes are made up of proteins, antibodies are made up of proteins. So lots of different proteins in the body.
Can I go in 1 second? Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry, it's all chemistry up there. I'm so excited. Okay, so look at the heme molecule and notice all the double bonds. Can you see those? And then I want you to notice, and I will talk about this, but each of the corners, each of the little crooks in there, all of those are carbon atoms. So that's how we sort of abbreviate carbon. So every one of those little corners is a carbon atom. And then the last thing I want to point out is there's a dotted line between the iron and the nitrogen, and those are going to what we're going to call intermolecular forces.
Wait,
So
it's
the
where?
little dotted lines between the nitrogen
Oh, okay.
and the vertical iron. So that is like an intermolecular force which is outside the molecule, but they have these attractions because of the different charges in the atoms. And so we'll talk about that, but I want to point that out so you can see it.
Very cool. And just since we're talking about that heme group, red blood cells only live about 120 days, so they break down really quick, and they need to go to the spleen to be broken down. And we recycle all these proteins, we recycle the amino acids in it, we take off the iron, we recycle that, we use that like dietary iron, but it's this heme group, this carbon skeleton structure that we have a problem with, and it has to be eliminated from the body. And so the spleen actually turns it into this yellowish pigment that if it accumulates in the body, you get a yellowish cast that we call jaundice. Do you guys know what the spleen converts this heme group to, what that yellow pigment molecule is? Bilirubin. Bilirubin. Then it has to go to the liver changes it, then it takes it to the small intestine, and then eventually we poop it out. Another big macromolecule are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are also polymers, and the individual units are what we call these monosaccharides. Carbohydrates are sugars, and so they're also called polysaccharides, but the individual units are these monosaccharides. And we're going to talk about glucose a lot. Okay, so glucose is a really common monosaccharide. But again, why am I bringing this up now? Look at the chemical structure. What are carbohydrates made out of?
Oxygen, hydrogen.
Oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. There's always going to be carbon. Life is carbon-based. Okay? And so carbohydrates are also abbreviated CHOs because they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Then we have lipids. Lipids are triglycerides. You have a glycerol head and then 3 fatty acid tails. What type of atoms do we find there? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. This is DNA. Makes up a large mass of the body. These are the individual monomers. These are the individual units. It's called a nucleotide. And what do we find here? We find carbons, oxygens, hydrogen, nitrogen. So we find nitrogen in the DNA. And we also find phosphorus. in the DNA.
Okay, so check out that phosphate group. Remember we talked about the polyatomic ion phosphate, PO4-3. I want you to notice that, because that's
There's the
that place where that shows up big time.
O4, yeah.
And
there's
it's
the
minus 1 because it's got a hydrogen and it's connected to an oxygen instead, so it's.
Cool. Another important molecule in the body is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It's the chemical form of energy that the cells use to do work. And this is the structure of ATP right here, made up of carbons, nitrogens, hydrogens, oxygens,
And check out the
phosphates.
3 phosphate groups, triphosphate, right? So again, there's that polyatomic ion.
What other elements have important functions in the body? Sodium and potassium and calcium are especially important in the nervous system. If you have a deficiency in any one of those, too high or too low or too high, you're going to have problems because it's going to mess with your nervous system. So sodium, potassium, and calcium are very important in the nervous system. The bones and teeth, we find phosphorus and calcium. And then, you know, there's about 0.1% of the body that are made up of what we call these trace elements. They're just found in small traces, and we can just finally measure them now. But these are things like iron, copper, cobalt, zinc, selenium, stuff like that. And they're finding more and more about these trace elements. I just found this article this morning and just put a little blurb up there on it. The role of essential trace elements in health and disease. And I have this article if anybody's interested in getting the PDF for that. This is an example of, this is one neuron communicating with another. And this is just an example of why sodium, potassium, and calcium are so important in the nervous system. What happens is you have this electricity that's running down the neuron, and you call that electricity a nerve impulse or an action potential. And what that is it's sodium. Okay? Electricity in the body is the flow of sodium. So you have this positively charged sodium that runs down the neuron. It gets to the end of the neuron and it opens what are called these voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium rushes into the cell, into the neuron, and what we have here, we have these spheres called synaptic vesicles, and these have neurotransmitters inside of them. Dopamine, acetylcholine, all that type of stuff, those are found within these vesicles. And calcium moving into the cell causes these vesicles to be transported down to the plasma membrane, and it releases these neurotransmitters onto another neuron. Those neurotransmitters bind to these receptors on the other neuron. These ion channels open, and just depending on, you know, there's multiple things that can happen, but if you want to excite this neuron below it, sodium rushes into the cell. If you want to inhibit it, chloride rushes into the cell. So again, just in a different example of where you find these different ions. You have sodium coming down, calcium, all very important. I just put a lot, might not have time to go through all these examples here, but here we have the thyroid gland, and you can, if you put your fingers on your neck, go from your chin right down below, you have 2 flat plates right there, and that's part of your larynx, and they're more pronounced in males because testosterone causes it to grow a little bit more. But wrapped around the larynx, a little superior below it, is your thyroid gland. And your thyroid gland is the major metabolic organ in the body. And what happens is it releases a hormone called thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone acts on pretty much every cell of the body to stimulate metabolism. There's 2 forms of thyroid hormone. There's what's called thyroxine, or T4, and there's also called triiodothyronine, or T3. And these are the chemical structures for T4 and T3, these 2 forms of thyroid hormone. And we have carbons, oxygens, hydrogens, carbons, nitrogens. But another new little element that we have here, iodine. Okay, so you need iodine to form thyroid hormone. And if you have a deficiency in your diet of iodine, then it messes with this whole hormonal axis, and it can cause your thyroid hormone to enlarge and form a goiter. Now, this isn't very common anymore. Iodine deficiencies aren't very common anymore. Why are they not very common anymore? What's a simple solution to prevent an iodine deficiency?
Like salt with iodine.
Iodized salt. But again, you know, we're finding these different elements, these different atoms there. There is a video that I want to reference.